Good morning, this is Ron. Welcome to Story Time. It's 6:28 on March 9th, 2017, and I'm recording this podcast on location at Lovebirds in Pasadena, California. And again, welcome to Story Time. So we're continuing with the book by the Ayn Rand called The Virtue of Selfishness, and we're at Chapter 15, Government Financing in a Free Society. What would be the proper method of financing the government in a fully free society? This question is usually asked in connection with the objectivist principle that the government of a free society may not initiate the use of physical force and may use force only in retaliation against those who initiate its use. Since the imposition of taxes does represent initiation of force, how, it is asked, would the government of a free country raise the money needed to finance its proper services? In a fully free society, taxation, or, to be exact, payment for governmental services would be voluntary. Since the proper services of a government, the police, the armed forces, the law courts, are demonstrably needed by individual citizens and affect their interests directly, the citizens would and should be willing to pay for such services as they pay for insurance. The question of how to implement the principle of voluntary government financing, how to determine the best means of applying it in practice, is a very complex one and belongs to the field of the philosophy of law. The task of political philosophy is only to establish the nature of the principle and to demonstrate that it is practicable. The choice of a specific method of implementation is more than premature today, since the principle will be practicable only in a fully free society, a society whose government has been constitutionally reduced to its proper basic functions. For a discussion of these functions, see Chapter 14. There are many possible methods of voluntary government financing. A government lottery, which has been used in some European countries, is one such method. There are others. As an illustration, and only as an illustration, consider the following possibility. One of the most vitally needed services which only a government can render is the protection of contractual agreements among citizens. Suppose that the government were to protect, i.e., to recognize as legally valid and enforceable, only those contracts which have been insured by the payment to the government of a premium in the amount of a legally fixed percentage of the sums involved in the contractual transaction. Such an insurance would not be compulsory. There would be no legal penalty imposed on those who did not choose to take it. They would be free to make verbal agreements or to sign uninsured contracts if they so wished. The only consequence would be that such agreements or contracts would not be legally enforceable. If they were broken, the injured party would not be able to seek redress in a court of law. All credit transactions are contractual agreements. A credit transaction is any exchange which involves a passage of time between the payment and the receipt of goods or services. This includes the vast majority of economic transactions in a complex industrial society. Only a very small part of the gigantic network of credit transactions ever ends up in court, but the entire network is made possible by the existence of the courts and would collapse overnight without that protection. This is a government service which people need, use, rely upon, and should pay for. Yet, today, this service is provided gratuitously and amounts, in effect, to a subsidy. When one considers the magnitude of the wealth involved in credit transactions, one can see that the percentage required to pay for such governmental insurance would be infinitesimal, much smaller than that paid for other types of insurance. Yet it would be sufficient to finance all the other functions of a proper government. If necessary, that percentage could be legally increased in time of war, or other, but similar, methods of raising money could be established for clearly defined wartime needs. This particular plan is mentioned here only as an illustration of a possible method of approach to the problem, not as a definitive answer, nor as a program to advocate at present. The legal and technical difficulties involved are enormous. They include such questions as the need of an ironclad constitutional provision to prevent the government from dictating the content of private contracts, an issue which exists today and needs much more objective definitions. The need of objective standards or safeguards for establishing the amount of the premiums, which cannot be left to the arbitrary discretion of the government, etc. Any program of voluntary government financing is the last, not the first, step on the road to a free society. The last, not the first, reform to advocate. It would work only when the basic principles and institutions of a free society have been established. It would not work today. Men would pay voluntarily for insurance protecting their contracts, but they would not pay voluntarily for insurance against the danger of aggression by Cambodia, nor would the plywood manufacturers of Wisconsin and their workers pay voluntarily for insurance to assist the development of the plywood industry of Japan, which would put them out of business. A program of voluntary government financing would be amply sufficient to pay for the legitimate functions of a proper government. It would not be sufficient to provide unearned support for the entire globe. But no type of taxation is sufficient for that. Only the suicide of a great country might be, and then only temporarily. Just as the growth of controls, taxes, and government obligations in this country was not accomplished overnight, so the process of liberation cannot be accomplished overnight. A process of liberation would be much more rapid than the process of enslavement had been, since the facts of reality would be its ally. But still, a gradual process is required, and any program of voluntary government financing has to be regarded as a goal for a distant future. What the advocates of a fully free society have to know at present is only the principle by which that goal can be achieved. The principle of voluntary government financing rests on the following premises: that the government is not the owner of the citizens' income and, therefore, cannot hold a blank check on that income, that the nature of the proper governmental services must be constitutionally defined and delimited, leaving the government no power to enlarge the scope of its services at its own arbitrary discretion. Consequently, the principle of voluntary government financing regards the government as the servant, not the ruler, of the citizens, as an agent who must be paid for his services, not as a benefactor whose services are gratuitous, who dispenses something for nothing. This last, along with the notion of compulsory taxation, is a remnant of the time when the government was regarded as the omnipotent ruler of the citizens, an absolute monarch who owned the work, income, property, and lives of his subjects. Had to be an unpaid benefactor, protector, and dispenser of favors. Such a monarch would have considered it demeaning to be paid for his services, just as the atavistic mentalities of his descendants in spirit, the remnants of Europe's ancient feudal aristocracy and the modern welfare status, still consider an earned commercial income as demeaning and as morally inferior to an unearned one which is acquired by mooching or looting, by charitable donations or governmental force. When a government, be it a monarch or a democratic parliament, is regarded as a provider of gratuitous services, it is only a question of time before it begins to enlarge its services and the sphere of the gratuitous. Today, this process is called the growth of the public sector of the economy, until it becomes, and has to become, the instrument of pressure group warfare, of economic groups looting one another. The premise to check and to challenge in this context is the primordial notion that any governmental services, even the legitimate ones, should be given to the citizens gratuitously. In order fully to translate into practice the American concept of the government as a servant of the citizens, one has to regard the government as a paid servant. Then, on that basis, one can proceed to devise the appropriate means of tying government revenues directly to the government services rendered. It may be observed in the example given above that the cost of such voluntary government financing would be automatically proportionate to the scale of an individual's economic activity. Those on the lowest economic levels, who seldom, if ever, engage in credit transactions, would be virtually exempt, though they would still enjoy the benefits of legal protection, such as that offered by the armed forces, by the police, and by the courts dealing with criminal offenses. These benefits may be regarded as a bonus to the men of lesser economic ability, made possible by the men of greater economic ability, without any sacrifice of the latter to the former. It is in their own interests that the men of greater ability have to pay for the maintenance of armed forces, for the protection of their country against invasion. Their expenses are not increased by the fact that a marginal part of the population is unable to contribute to these costs. Economically, that marginal group is non-existent as far as the costs of war are concerned. The same is true of the costs of maintaining a police force. It is in their own interest that the abler men have to pay for the apprehension of criminals, regardless of whether the specific victim of a given crime is rich or poor. It is important to note that this type of free protection for the non-contributors represents an indirect benefit and is merely a marginal consequence of the contributors' own interests and expenses. This type of bonus cannot be stretched to cover direct benefits or to claim, as the welfare statists are claiming, that direct handouts to the non-producers are in the producers' own interests. The difference, briefly, is as follows. If a railroad were running a train and allowed the poor to ride without payment in the seats left empty, it would not be the same thing, nor the same principle, as providing the poor with first-class carriages and special trains. Any type of non-sacrificial assistance of social bonus, gratuitous benefit, or gift value possible among men is possible only in a free society, and is proper so long as it is non-sacrificial. But in a free society under a system of voluntary government financing, there would be no legal loophole. No legal possibility for any redistribution of wealth for the unearned support of some men by the forced labor and extorted income of others, for the draining, exploitation, and destruction of those who are able to pay the costs of maintaining a civilized society, in favor of those who are unable or unwilling to pay the cost of maintaining their own existence. And that was chapter 15 of Ayn Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. She wrote this particular chapter in February 1964. All of the chapters in this book are basically excerpts from speeches or articles that Ayn Rand or Nathaniel Branden had written, and so each chapter has a different date to it. On the back of the book, it reads, The Virtue of Selfishness. Ayn Rand here sets forth the moral principles of objectivism, the philosophy that holds man's life, life proper to a rational being, as the standard of moral values, and regards altruism as incompatible with man's nature, with the creative requirements of his survival, and with a free society. Ayn Rand wrote Atlas Shrugged, philosophically the most challenging bestseller of its time. Her first novel, We the Living, was published in 1936. With the publication of The Fountainhead in 1943, she achieved a spectacular and enduring success. Miss Rand's unique philosophy, objectivism, has gained a worldwide audience. The fundamentals of her philosophy are set forth in 4 nonfiction books: Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, For the New Intellectual, The Virtue of Selfishness, and Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. The magnificent statement of her artistic credo, The Romantic Manifesto, is also available in a Signet edition. One of the comments I want to make about the chapter that we just read, chapter 15, is that it is, Ayn Rand was right about a lot of things and wrong about a few. One of the things that she was wrong about was in creating her, quote, own, unquote, philosophy. In so doing, and she always promotes objectivity, but in creating objectivism, she ironically ceased to be objective from that moment forward. She ceased to be realistic. She became idealistic, really no different than the socialists that she opposed. This chapter is an excellent example. Let me get to the beginning. That's the nature of government. Let me see if we can get to the beginning here so I can... where it is an excellent example. Government financing in a free society. So, and the first question, the first sentence in the book, what would be the proper method of financing the government in a fully free society? And right there she is indicating an ideal. The fully free society as an ideal. And it seems today there are no realists. Conservatives should be realists and realistic, but very often they are not. They're just as idealistic as the socialists. The only difference between conservatives, libertarians, objectivists, and socialists is the ideal that each group is striving for. The true conservative is the person that makes the presumption for the status quo. If she wanted to be objective, about this particular chapter about government financing, then it would have been government financing in American society. It would have dealt with a specific government, or maybe government financing in Cuban society, or Venezuelan, or Swedish, or whatever. But dealing with making it realistic by discussing government financing as it relates to a specific and real government and country. So the other thing I wanted to say about there's a lot of talk always about the government. Big government, small government. Do you want the government to do this? Do you want the government to do that? The proper definition of the word government is the apparatus by which political parties wield power. Then when we're talking about the government doing anything, the government doesn't do anything. It is political parties, whichever political party happens to be in power at the moment in any particular locality or situation, that is actually doing something. They are wielding power, and they're using the mechanisms of government, the laws, the buildings, the vehicles. In the case of police and the military, the guns and other weapons that they may have. So, let's see. Trying to find out. So when you think about that and you're reading this chapter, it, like it says, a society whose government has been constitutionally reduced to its proper basic functions. Well, the government, again, the laws, the government of the United States is the Constitution. That's the basic part of the government. And so the government itself in the United States has been reduced to its proper function. The question is, are the people in the political parties, the individuals, the people collectively, the Congress, the Senate, or the U.S. House of Representatives, the Senate, and the executive branch and the judicial branch, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing under the law, under the Constitution? That's the real issue. And along those lines, the idea of big government or small government, there's nowhere in the Constitution that reads how big the government should or shouldn't be. There's nothing in the Constitution that prohibits big government or encourages small government. There's only constitutional government, a government that does what it's limited to do. So the whole idea of big and small government is really a red herring, something that really we shouldn't be even bothering with to think about or to discuss. In any case, that's the end of today's episode of Story Time. The next episode is going to be Tuesday. So the 14th of March. And so I will see you then. I'm glad you joined me, and I hope everybody has a nice weekend.